So, to understand where this intersects with Haraway, we might want to think about a question that's been implicit through many historical accounts of the history of computing and the history of cybernetics, the history of digital culture, which is digital culture masculinist? Generally speaking, the history of digital technologies is dominated by white men, particularly white American men, in the 1950s and 1960s. And it goes hand in hand with a series of fantasies about technology. So, for example, fantasies of cyborgs and androids as sexual slaves, particularly female robots as sexual slaves. Also, this idea of overcoming the body. So, cybernetics, information theory, ideas of virtual reality, all of this notion that somehow you can overcome the body and just live in a virtual world. And there's this question, are these ideas somehow shaped by gender or political hierarchies that privilege particular types of questions associated with the types of researchers, white American male researchers, doing this study? And of course, in the same period when you see the rise of cybernetics, information theory, ideas of the cyborg, you also have the proliferation of science fiction, which is generally an abode of men. It's generally written by and for men. There are important exceptions to that. You also have Silicon Valley, the origins of Silicon Valley, and even today, and Silicon Valley is dominated by largely men. And so, if you start looking at the fantasies, the technologies, the aspirations associated with cybernetics, associated with cyborgs, is there a kind of masculinist fantasy governing this? This is a question, and might it somehow be shaped by Cold War, militarism, capitalism, the political dynamics that embed the development of these technologies? This also raises a question. Could there be another approach to digital culture? Another approach to thinking about computing and culture that is not governed by the same constraints? So the Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway is a celebrated 1980s effort to write new fictions, new fantasies to these masculinist, militarist technologies associated with cybernetics, computing, and information theory. Interestingly, it doesn't throw the history of technology away. It doesn't discard all these traditions, but it rewrites them according to a new kind of problematic, a new set of tensions and dynamics. It's not about the digital per se. The Cyborg Manifesto does not tell you what digital culture is, but it uses key ideas from digital culture, information, cybernetics, computing, to rethink what it means to have a body, to be a woman, to be gendered. And so the Cyborg Manifesto is very much about the changing meaning of feminism in a technical age, the changing meaning of embodiment in a cybernetic age. There's also background questions about labor, political economy, racism, colonialism, that shape and orient the analysis. And what Haraway does is she uses the figure of the cyborg as a way to reimagine bodies for a new kind of feminist practice. If the cyborg has this vision of the body and experiences and supplementation all being refashioned to overcome evolution, Haraway is essentially asking the question, well, maybe this offers possibilities of a new sexual politics. Maybe it offers possibilities of a new fiction or imagination of human bodies and technologies that's not governed by masculinist narratives. And part of the trick of Donna Haraway's analysis is it's ironic. Okay, she doesn't literally mean we should all become cyborgs. However, she does say in a way, social reality is fashioned. And to a certain extent, even biology is fashioned. It's historical. And we have to live within the society that is around us. We can't invent society from scratch, which means we have to take its technologies, its fantasies, and from a critical Marxist feminist perspective, turn the existing technologies towards new possibilities of liberation. And so what if we take the cyborg, Haraway is essentially suggesting, as a kind of utopia, and we do it ironically. We're not completely subscribing to it, but we're sort of saying, well, this is what we have, this is the world we live in, and let's imagine a new world from the position of these limited technologies, knowing that this imagination itself is deeply problematic and it's not a true utopia. It's not a place we really want to live in. It's a provocation. It's an intervention. It's playful. So the essay appears a variety of times. It first appears, I think, in 1983, and it's republished multiple times. For Haraway, it's as much about politics as about technology. It's about a new political myth. She says she wants to be faithful to feminism, to socialism, and materialism, which is to say, she wants to start rethinking cybernetics, information, communication, technology, with a concern for debates at the center of feminism, what is gender, socialism, the equitable distribution of resources, and materialism. You could call that Marxist critical analysis of power. And she puts the cyborg at the center of this new myth that is sensitive to feminism, socialism, and materialism. And she says the cyborg is a creature both of social reality, that is the world in which we live. We are, in a sense, living in a world of cybernetic organisms where we're embedded and surrounded by technologies that shape our body. But the cyborg is also a creature of fiction. Cyborgs are the stuff of movies and literature. And she's suggesting there's a collaborative relationship between the actual world we live in and fantasies. The boundary between science fiction and social reality is, says Haraway, unstable. It's kind of leaky. The two are impinging upon one another. And by the same measure, in a cybernetic age, the body and technology are also kind of leaky. They shape and condition one another. So to take a couple of key quotes from Haraway, she writes, "I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess." This is a famous passage. And what she says is that traditional feminism, particularly first wave feminism of the 1960s, early 1970s, had what she thought was a very problematic notion of the female body as being associated with nature, as being associated with child rearing and things like that. And she says, in a way, it has this idea of, a kind of feminine essence that is itself a kind of myth of the natural properties of woman, right? And she's sort of summarizing this mythology in terms of the goddess. And Haraway says, I should say goddess. Yeah, just say goddess. She's saying, I would rather think about becoming a cyborg, not a creature of nature, not a creature of paganism, but a creature of history, a creature that is fashioned through the world we live in according to history and technology and our changing social reality and the fictions of our moment. And she's saying in her ironic utopia, maybe this is the possibility for overcoming traditional gender binaries, gender hierarchies. And in this analysis, she says she's intervening in what she calls the informatics of domination, which is to say, according to Haraway, we live in an era where the control of society, the control of politics, the control of power is shaped by informatics, by information and communication technologies, and that informatics is a practice of domination. It's a practice of control. She wants to reappropriate histories of informatics. She wants to reimagine these ideas of cybernetics and information theory from the mid-20th century, the idea of the cyborg that comes out of NASA and the mental hospital. And she wants to reimagine it according to a new feminist mythology. For our own purposes, we're some decades after Haraway. We're now in the 21st century. Not in the 20th century. This should say it's an attempt to acknowledge the reality of informatics in the late 20th century and to reclaim it. We're now writing in the 21st century. We're reading it in the 21st century, where our moment has changed. She was writing from the moment of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan, the great clash between America and the Soviets, in which the space race was the major point of reference for cybernetic and informatic technologies. At least it was one major. And her myth was crafted to that moment. And part of the question is, in our own moment, what are the new kind of fictions that we might craft around something like the cyborg? Is it still a useful concept? She uses it to pry apart the concept of sex, the notion of sex as limited, as connected to biology, and she starts putting emphasis on a concept of gender, on the performative nature of gender. But this builds on, of course, the literature on cyborgs, on the literature from the 1960s that starts showing that maybe we can have an evolution of the body that is not strictly biological and so-called natural, but is shaped by technical supplementation. And so she's turning these ideas not just to think about living on space, but also to rethink reproduction itself. Not reproduction in the sense of having sex and making new bodies, but rather social reproduction, cultural reproduction. We're constantly making our society and making one another through the fantasies we have about one another, through the techniques we use to organize bodies and relationships. And this whole process of technical supplementation, maybe it can be applied directly to debates that have governed understanding of sex and gender and social roles. One of the things she writes is that identities seem contradictory, partial, and strategic. With the hard-won recognition of their social and historical constitution, gender, race, and class cannot provide the basis for belief in essential unity. There is nothing about being female that naturally binds women. This is a key aspect of her argument. Basically, what she's saying is that identity is constructed. Okay, race, gender, class, these are not permanent, enduring identities that precede us and exceed us and that define the essence of who we are. She's saying the categories of race, the categories of gender, the categories of class change according to social context, change according to historical setting. But we live in a society that is constantly trying to say your gender, your race, your class are who you are. They're trying to say this binds you to a particular destiny, a particular possibility. And she wants to say, actually, perhaps we want to look at these as historical facts, socially and culturally produced factors, which leads to a kind of new, interesting alliance with the cyborg. The cyborg is about producing a body, historically, culturally, technically. And she's saying, well, part of the interest in a cyborg history is maybe in a way we've always already been cyborgs. Maybe our sense of our body, our sense of our sex, was always being shaped by cultural and historical circumstances. Maybe race itself is not a permanent part of the body, but is a social and cultural and even technological construction. If so, argues Haraway, there's a new possibility for liberation. Okay, on one hand, feminism is weakened to the extent that there is no essential and permanent feminine identity or female sexuality that can provide a basis for political action. because that identity is not essential. It's historical and cultural and produced. But once we recognize it as being partial, strategic, contradictory, then we also start recognizing that our sexual identities can be reinvented, can be refashioned. We can create new strategic alliances. We can exploit the contradictions of our identity to pry it apart and to find new political possibilities.